We're here on Daf Vav Amid Beis at the Mishnah. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov Omer, Moshchin es hamayim mi'ilon le'ilon. U'bilvad shelo yashke es kol asada. On the one hand, Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov is Mekil, and he allows you to draw the water from one tree to another tree on Chol Moed, but nevertheless, he's not going to allow you to water the entire field. The rest of the field is not made of trees, but rather of grains. It's a stay lavan, and specifically what's called a beis habal that we discussed that grows from rainwater. So whereas the trees need the irrigation, the grains do not need irrigation. They can survive without irrigation. And therefore, I'm going to allow you, says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, to water the area that's under each and every one of the trees on Chol Moed, but the land in between, which is already a stay beis habal, that doesn't need watering. It's not critical. Now, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov doesn't deny that watering the entire field would have a positive effect on the trees as well as the grains, but nevertheless, it's not essential to the trees. And Zroim shelo shasu lifnei hamoed lo yashkem b'moed. Now we're talking about Zroim, and we didn't regularly water them before the Moed, and therefore that indicates that since we weren't accustomed to water them on a regular basis, no harm and no tragedy will fall if water is not provided on Chol Moed. They'll survive. And the Chachamim say, Matirim b'zeh b'zeh. In both cases, they're mekil. They're going to allow you to water the entire field, including the parts of the field that are not growing trees. And even in a case of plants that weren't regularly watered, and therefore, even if we withhold water, as we said before, it would not be critical. Nevertheless, this shita of the Chachamim is identical with the shita of Rabbi Meir at the beginning of the Masechet on Daf Beis, that even even with regard to a stay beis habal, which is supplied with water by rain, we're allowed to water it on Chol Moed in order to enhance its growth. Rabbi Yehuda im haisa sada mitunenes mutar. Let's say you have a field that naturally is moist, and then it dried up. And since it got used to, I guess there's addiction even when it comes to tzmachim that grow in the fields. So this is a case of a sada that is dependent upon rain, not because it really needs rain, but because it's naturally moist, and then it got dried up. And this is Rabbi Yehuda who's making a comment here on Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov to tell us that here's the exception to the rule. And even though Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov was machmir b'vad shelo yashkes kol asada, because the field itself will survive without the water, but in this case of a sada mitunenes, even Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, argues Rabbi Yehuda, would accept this as an exception to the rule, because since this field is moist as a general rule, but now it became dry, then if you fail to water it, in such a case, such a field, it's going to be an irretrievable loss. The plants got used to and addicted to an abundance of moisture. Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brisa to support this. Amru osolash kosan b'moed. When we said that you're not allowed to rain, if you have a beis habal that is watered by rain, then those plants cannot be watered on Chol Moed. Lo amru el bizroim shelo shasu lifnei hamoed. These were not Zroim plants that were addicted to water regularly before the Moed, if they were, so to speak, addicted, they were used to regularly being watered before the Moed, then mutter. Again, if you have a field that's naturally moist and it's used to water, now it's dried up, you're allowed to water it. The mashkin sada garid b'moed, but you're not allowed to water a dry field on chol moed. If it's naturally dry and it generally subsists exclusively on rainwater, and it's accustomed to dryness, it can go for a long time without water. It's like you have in human beings also. There are certain human beings that get used to going a long time without water. Other human beings get dehydrated almost immediately. Amar Avina, Shmami na. Let's derive by analogy the following halachic ruling. Hai tarbitza. Tarbitza is a garden patch. Shari litarbutze begula demoeda. You're allowed to do sprinkling. Sprinkling water, as a general rule, on plants, on chol moed is mut, because that's not a tirchi yisera. And even though the patch would survive, even if you left it without water, however, sprinkling lightly water in order to bring up the vegetables, that's mutter. That's called litarbute, as opposed to mashkin or hashka. So it's a mere sprinkling, and that you're allowed to do on chol moed. And how does Ravina derive this from the Brisa? Because the Brisa says sadeh stay garid is prohibited, according to the Tanakama. Ein mashkin stay garid b'moed. My timer, why is this dry field prohibited? You're not allowed to irrigate it on chol moed because the afla mashvele cholfa. Just 1 second. Stay guard my timer. Oh, I'm sorry. We're going not according to the Tanakama, but according to the Heter, the leniency of the Chachamim. And Ravina wants to derive a conclusion by analogy from the Kula of the Chachamim. The Afla Mashvile Cholfa, the process of Afla means to irrigate, makes it Cholfa. Cholfa means it speeds up the process of growth. And if you have a late Afla doesn't mean irrigate. Afla means a late crop. You want to make it into an earlier crop such that it would develop earlier, accelerate its growth. And again, it's not because the crop is in danger of withering away if you don't water it, but the Chachamim permitted on Chol Moed to speed up the process of growth. Is Hachinami here too, in the case of the garden patch, Mashve le Charfa. The sprinkling of water will convert a late crop into an early crop. It's going to accelerate the growth of the crop. And that's mutter. Tosfos is bothered by this because we, generally speaking, follow La Halacha Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov whenever he expresses his opinion in the Mishnah, and yet Ravina is building himself on the sheet of the Chachamim. And Tosfos explains Ravina that since the Chachamim allow even a thorough watering of a field in order to accelerate its growth, it stands to reason that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov would at least admit and concede that light sprinkling of a garden patch is permissible, since very little effort is necessary. So Tosfos comes to the conclusion that Ravina's heter in the case of Tarbute Bechula applies even according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a Brisa. Marbitzim stay lavan b'shvitz. We're allowed to sprinkle a stay lavan, which is growing crops, and which is watered by rainwater, on shvitz. Avalo b'moed. we're going to be more machmir on Moed. Now, normally speaking, the chumrah on Moed is because of tircha yisera. And if we're talking about a grain field, a stay lavan, then why is sprinkling considered a tircha yisera? Why is the heter applicable to the stay lavan during Shemitah, but not during Chol HaMoed? And we're going to have to say that somehow, according to this shita, although, just one second, but you see, Tosas Dibra Maskil Marbitzin. And he says, L'kachner Yoser Chamishlefi Dashka Gmura Asura Bebeis Habal Varbotza Muetet Shari B'Shvius B'Moed Asur Afilu Harbotza Muetes L'Rab Elazar ben Yaakov. So Tos again l'shitaso that we accept Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, and Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov is going to be machmir even for Harbotza Muetes, even sprinkling of water. And that's how the Gemara is going to reconcile a stira now. V'ha Tanya, we learned in a brisa, marbitzim bein b'moed, bein b'shvius. So how do we reconcile this? Now you're being matir even in moed, sprinkling a grain field. Amar Avuna lo kasha ha Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov ha Rabbana. So Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov in our Mishnah was machmir, and he passed that it's also to water the entire field. He really wants to water the trees, and that will allow, but you're not allowed to water the field. Even sprinkling is also like that. That's the first of our two brises over here. On the other hand, the Chachamim say that watering the entire field is mutter, and how much more so sprinkling is going to be mutter. Tanya Idach, we have another brisa. Marbitzin stay lavan erev shvius. That only before shvius, when we have an Easter of Tosefes shvius, only then will we be makil and allow sprinkling a grain field. Kidei sheyasu yetzu yirakas b'shvius. Now, apparently, it was quite common for people to sprinkle their fields after the harvesting of the grains to trigger the sprouting of dormant vegetable seeds. And certain aspects of Shemitah prohibitions would set in, as we discussed earlier, a month before the Shemitah year, before Rosh Hashanah. Cultivation of a field is forbidden towards the end of the pre-Shemitah year, if its purpose is merely to provide benefit during the Shemitah year. The Brisa teaches that sprinkling the field is permissible. So these prohibitions during Tosefes Shvius only apply to Hashkah, but not to sprinkling. And the Chiddush is, even though it's Kidei Sheyetzu Yerakos B'Shvius, nevertheless, since we're talking about Erev Shvius, therefore it's mutter. So you have a combination of two factors. Number one, it's Erev Shvius, and number two, he's only sprinkling the stay lavan. V'lo od, el shemar bitzim stay lavan b'shvius. Even during shvius, in the following condition, we're allowing sprinkling, and that is kadei sheyetzu yirakos l'motzei shvius. So his purpose is not to sprinkle the field during Shemitah for the purpose of making it sprout during Shemitah, but rather for the purpose of making it sprout after the conclusion of Shemitah. And this leads us to the Mishnah of exterminating animals. on Chol Moed and Shvius. Tzadines are ishus ves akbarim. So we'll see what ishus means in a minute, but akbarim means mice. And these mice might eat up from the fields. And we're talking about a stay Elon and a stay Lama. No difference between trees, an orchard, and a grain field. Kidarko, b'moed u'b'shvius. According to Tanakama, we could be makil, and we can trap these animals, these rodents, in the usual way. Chachamarim no. Mistay Elon kidarko, mistay love and shalo kidarko. Will be makil in the case of an orchard, where these creatures will really attack the orchard and destroy it, and therefore we can be makil and go ahead and trap it in any way that's usual, but we stay lavan shalo kedarko. In the case of a stay lavan, he's got to do it shalo kedarko, because these rodents do not damage a grain field as significantly as they would damage an orchard where they eat at the roots of the tree. So since the potential loss in a grain field is relatively minor, the trapping must be done in an unusual way. This is a classic case of violating Kol Moed with a shinui. And that we're makil on if there's some tzorah. So whereas the Tanakam is makil in a stay love and he allows trapping kedarko, the Chachamim disagree, and in the case of a stay love, they only allow it shalo kedarko. My ishus, what is ishus? Amar Rabbi Yehuda, he's going to derive this from a pasuk bria she'ein la einayim. Now, what does it mean ein la einayim? We're talking about a blind, a rodent of some sort that burrows its way underground, and it's a mole. It has tiny eyes that are covered with skin, and it leaves it blind. And it spends much time underground and emerges. It is blinded by the sunlight. And how do we see this in a pasuk? He's going to derive this from a pasuk in Tilim. The pasuk says, "Kimo shablul temes," like a snail that melts. Yaloch nefel eshes. Again, there's that word eshes that we're looking for. Bal chazu shemesh. It slithers away. And what is it? It's the falling of an ishes that never saw the sunlight, because it, as we said before, it's constantly underground. And it never sees the sunlight. When it sees the sunlight, it's blinded by the sunlight. And this is the way David HaMelech curses evildoers. And he wishes upon them the fate of these unfortunate creatures. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a Brisa. Sadin esa ichus vesachborim mistei alovin mistei ilon kedarko. And this is again the chita of the Tanakama. And we could be makil even in the case of a grain field. And we could trap the mice in the normal way, even though it's Chol Moed. Umachrivim chorei nemolim. We'll have a long discussion about this. We could destroy ant holes on Chol Moed. Ketzad. How do we go about destroying ant holes? Ketzad machrivin. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer. Mevi offer. We have to bring foreign dirt. Michar zeh v'nosein l'toch char zeh. Vein cholkin zeh zeh. So it means that somehow by bringing this offer from a far off place, we'll see what that means in a minute, then it chokes the ants to death. Omer Rav Yemar bar Shalmiya b'shmei Abaye, and I apologize for the noise, in the name of Abaye, for who the koi betray ibri denare. How far are these two holes located one from the other? They're on two sides of a river, Fudaleka Gishra, and there's no bridge that could take you across the river, and therefore there's no, generally speaking, there's no offer that goes from one side to the other, Hudaleka Gamla, and there's no plank that you could cross, Hudaleka Mitzra, there's no rope that stretches across it, and basically, therefore, what we have is the ants will, if the crosses were present, then the ants would recognize the dirt that was brought from the other side of the river. Ad kama, ad parsa. So what distance are these two ant holes considered separated? Otherwise, if they're within that area, they're too close, is ad parsa. Parsa is 2,000 amos. So here's where we're going to stop on the top of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph.